Thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to the 6th and final webinar in our series for Legacy Cannabis Genetics, People and Their Plants, a community-driven study. And today we'll be exploring the IP and public policy research track of the project. Little bit of housekeeping. We have a Q&A feature open. And so if you have questions for Ross and I, as we're presenting, please put those in the Q&A and we'll field them as we can. We are going to open for Q&A and discussion a little bit later in the presentation. And we've got the chat open as well. So feel free to use that to communicate with each other. And please stay on mute if you could during the presentation. And use the raise hand feature when we get to discussion and Q&A if you're able to access it. Otherwise, just let us know and we'll go ahead and put you in the queue. Great. Well, I thought I would open by introducing myself. My name is Janine Coleman, and I'm the Executive Director of Origins Council. And we'll share a little bit about our organization here in a moment. But about myself, I just wanted to share that I have a background in fine and performing arts, marketing, education, and I've cultivated cannabis for over 25 years before I started studying cannabis as an herbal medicine and getting involved in patient advocacy. I've had the experience of being involved in 2 criminal cannabis cases personally, and thankfully I've been very fortunate in both instances in terms of the legal outcomes. The second case was right before California passed the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act. And after 2 years of fighting our case, it was apparent to me that the landscape for cannabis in California was changing. Proposition 64 was on the ballot, and Mendocino County, where I lived at the time, had a local cannabis regulation and taxation measure on the ballot. I got involved in that campaign, and shortly thereafter, I joined the board of the California Growers Association and co-founded the Mendocino Appellations Project. Several years later, I founded the Origins Council. And I'll share a bit more about our organization in a moment. And right now, I'd like to pass it to my friend and colleague, Ross Gordon, to introduce himself.
Happy Friday, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Janine. My name is Ross Gordon. I'm a policy analyst with Origins Council. My background is mostly in cannabis policy and law. So I moved to California about 10 years ago in 2015 out of college. Started working for a law firm that at that time was working with cannabis-involved folks who were operating under the Proposition 215 framework. And I think what really stood out to me and made me want to continue to be part of the cannabis community was seeing how much in that sort of pre-Proposition 64 era, the people who were involved in cannabis really looked like California. It wasn't a corporatized industry like most other industries, and really had an incredible amount of passion for the plant and its uses and its medicinal properties. And so coming into that context in 2015, just as the legal structure with the MMRSA and Proposition 64 was coming into effect, made me really interested in how those new laws were going to affect this community, which had really come up around Proposition 215. So originally, I was living in Oakland when I moved to California, working with a lot of small businesses there, but also met a lot of farmers in the rural areas of the states while I was working at that law firm as a paralegal. And ended up working starting in 2018 with California Growers Association on cannabis policy, mostly at the state level in California. In 2019, I moved up to Humboldt County, started working with Humboldt County Growers Alliance on policy, both county level and state level. And then over the past couple of years, have started working more with Origins Council, again on state policy and a little bit of federal cannabis policy also. So a lot of what I do historically has been a lot of the policy issues that affect cannabis, especially farmers every day, regulatory framework, taxation, market access. But I think intellectual property is a big piece of that also. It always has been a big piece of the policy landscape that affects legacy producing communities, and I think has the opportunity to continue to be a really major impact on our communities going forward. So really excited to be part of this research and to talk a little bit today about what it is that we're looking at.
I want to share a bit about our organization. Origins Council was founded in 2019 as a nonprofit education, research, and advocacy organization. And really, it was formed in response to the impact of legalization on our legacy farming communities, which we were already starting to see unfold at that time. And our mission is focused on sustainable rural economic development within cannabis producing regions. And I just really want to speak for a moment and say personally, this year is significant for me because it marks a decade as a student of Appalachians law and policy. And we'll speak to that a bit later in the presentation. Really got involved in studying Appalachians as an outgrowing of the advocacy work, particularly with the legacy producing communities. And, in really studying it, I've understood that the history of Appalachians has really demonstrated the tremendous power of this IP and public policy system to protect and promote craft producers in particular around the world and really on a generational scale. And so that's why we've really adopted this as the second part of our organizational mission. The repealing of prohibition in California really, it held promise. And I think we were all really excited for the opportunity to transition into a regulated framework and really engage the market initially. However, the reality on the ground for small scale producers 8 years in is revealing that we are very far from achieving any meaningful metrics of success, particularly for small businesses and legacy producers. And, I think that it really warrants saying that the public policy frameworks and market structures that flow from them must meaningfully support the cultural preservation and the economic success of legacy farming communities. And until that time, we really do remain a legally marginalized people. And so we continue to work for change. We can go ahead and advance the slide. Thank you. So Origins Council is community driven, and we really base our work upon research. We are partnered with community-based organizations throughout the legacy cannabis farming regions of California, and our work supported by subject matter experts, academic advisors, professional policy analysts, and advocates. And, this is really a strategy that we adopted from the onset of forming with the intention of strengthening and amplifying the respective and collective voices of the communities we serve. And I think that served us well. And this project's been an amazing opportunity to build on that. So we have two programs that we run, a government affairs program. We're active on the state and the federal level with our policy advocacy, and our community-based organizations that are partnered with us in that program really govern the policy positions and the policy platform of that program. And we represent collectively their membership base in our advocacy work. And within our research, education, and development program, which is the second program Origins Council runs, we work with the community-based organizations that we're partnered with in that program to really serve as advisors to us and to serve as community liaisons, particularly as it pertains to any community engaged research that we're participating in. So now to move forward and get into the DCC priority research topic, if you could advance the slide, please. So in 2021, the California Department of Cannabis Control put out a call for cannabis research proposals. So just a little bit of background, Proposition 64 provides for $10 million of cannabis tax funds to go to cannabis research in California every year. And so the Department of Cannabis Control puts forward research topics that they would like to see proposals come forward for, and you're also able to put forward proposals beyond what specifically they're asking for. So this proposal really resonated with our organization, California Legacy Genetics and Genetic Sequencing. Really want to I think, hone in on the heart of the proposal and read what they put forward. To identify and preserve the history, value, and diversity of California legacy cannabis cultivars and the rich experience of its legacy cultivation community, and to enable, enhance, and guide the understanding and application of cannabis genetics in the greater body of research and science-based public policy development. And this next piece, I really want to give credit where credit's due, for the Department of Cannabis Control requiring that research proposals include a culturally sensitive community outreach and engagement plan and methodologies by which breeders and cultivators can protect their IP and their genetic resources. Next slide, please. So our team of academic researchers, scientists, and community-based organizations joined forces to propose our project, which is a multidisciplinary community-based participatory research project. In 2023, the DCC awarded our team $2.7 million to pursue the study, and the study will conclude in late 2026. So this is all of the partners on the study, and we're really grateful to be working with these amazing organizations, institutions, and researchers. Next slide, please. So in considering how to design the project to meet the DCC mandate for an outreach and engagement plan that's culturally sensitive, we agreed as a team to pursue this project using community-based participatory research methodology. CBPR, as it's called, is a pioneering field of community engaged research, and it's really premised on partnership between the community and academic researchers for the purpose of community empowerment. It's largely been developed in the field of public health and really an outflowing of social justice work with marginalized communities. And I want to take a moment and say that we've been extremely fortunate to be working with an amazing human being and a nationally recognized expert in CBPR, Dr. Marge Plum. And if you're not able to attend our webinar that really went in depth around our CBPR and culturally sensitive community engagement plan, please go to our website, and we've got the recording from that webinar, which was from December 6th. And so, just really want to emphasize that CBPR is really about partnership and authority that the community shares with the research team through all stages of the research. So from engaging the funders and the academic institutions that are involved, to defining the research questions and the objectives and ensuring that those are really of value to the community, designing the research plan itself, and of course, really leading in the community engagement and supporting research participant recruitment, supporting the research activities and the analysis of the research, contributions to the research papers and other deliverables from the project, and then finally public dissemination of the research findings, which is really critical in CBPR in terms of getting the work and the results of the work out to the community. I want to offer just a quote that I really appreciated from a paper, and I'll put the paper in the chat for you all if you're interested in looking into it. And it speaks to CBPR's aim being to create positive, transformative, and sustainable change together with, for, and in communities. And I think that's a really beautiful way of framing it. Next slide, please, Russ. Okay, so to speak to our culturally sensitive community outreach engagement plan, we included education. That's, I think, something that was really important to us as a starting place in terms of engaging the community and empowering the community. Really starts with education. Informed consent is a term that's used in research, and it's really about making sure that research participants understand the purpose of the research, how their information and participation will be used in the research. And so education is a really big piece of this project in particular. the scope that we'll be working on here. And, you know, to really talk about our plan, you know, something that we really wanted to emphasize in the plan was to create as many opportunities for community engagement as possible. We really wanted to ensure that in leading with education and empowering the community, or working to empower the community through that education, there were as many channels as possible. And so to speak to some of those things, we are working right now to establish a community advisory board. We'll speak more to that later. Our website is really intended to be a clearinghouse for the project. And so being as communicative, transparent, and sharing information about the project in real time via our website is something that we're really focused on. So it'll be building and iterating as the project unfolds. You know, this is the end of our series that we put forward, and really want to encourage folks, if you've not been able to attend, to go ahead to our website and check out the recordings of our previous webinars. Each of the researchers and their teams were able to really go into the details of each of the subscopes within the research project, and really explain the purpose and approach, and how it all comes together as well. We are really excited to be hosting a series of community meetings coming up this year. So we're going to be moving all throughout the state within all the study areas, and those meetings will support, first and foremost, the ability for the community to meet with and speak directly to the research team. We're going to have some experiential learning opportunities, and also a forum to really engage the community and garner your input and further engagement with the project. Yeah, so I think we can go ahead to the next slide, thanks. One thing that I do want to emphasize is a little bit later in the webinar, we're going to be inviting you all to share your ideas relative to IP and public policy. And so, you know, we'll get there shortly, and we just are going to want to invite you to bring your questions, your concerns, your needs as relates to the intersection of IP, public policy, and legacy cannabis genetics and communities. And look forward to continuing those conversations again in the community meetings. So our particular research track regarding intellectual property and public policy really builds upon the work and the education that LeafWorks is working on, one of our partners in the grant here. And if you didn't have an opportunity to see that webinar, that was the last webinar that we did, I think 3 weeks ago now. It's up on our website. And, you know, fundamental to being able to protect your genetic resources and leverage your genetic resources as intellectual property is the ability to really properly document your genetic holdings and the naming of your genetic holdings. And so the work that LeafWorks is doing in that regard in the project is really fundamental to be able to take the next steps as a business or as an individual in terms of protecting and potentially leveraging for commercial purposes your genetic resources. So we're really focused on researching legal instruments, whether they be intellectual property for individuals or broader public policy instruments that support the stewarding of genetic diversity of our cultivators and breeders, and again, protecting novel genetics and really understanding what can be protected and really what are novel genetics. And you know, for those that are interested in pursuing commercial endeavors, how to leverage their genetic resources, whether collectively as a community or individually. So the outputs of the research, you know, the research is going to inform the educational programming that we're going to be providing throughout our community events and throughout the project broadly. And we're going to produce a white paper on this topic. And then the research that we're doing in this track will help to inform a suite of public policy recommendations. That's a deliverable of the entire project. And we're really grateful to have an amazing team supporting this work, including a number of legal advisors that are experts in their field. And so Ross and I are learning a lot and really appreciate the opportunity to facilitate all these brilliant minds coming together to work on this. So probably a good place to just start with some basic definitions. So what is intellectual property and how do we define public policy? So the definition that I gravitated towards here is from St. Francis School of Law. And they put forward any and all rights associated with intangible assets owned by a person or a company or a community, I'd add, and protected against use without consent. Intangible assets refer to non-physical property, including right of ownership and intellectual property. So generally, when people think of intellectual property, they're thinking of ideas such as copyright or images, trademarked images. Genetic resources are tangible, but perhaps the way that we engage with them can be considered intangible. So that's kind of an interesting kind of edge case, I think, for the application of that definition. So looking at public policy, really, I think the heart of it is looking at law, right? So statute, regulation, more on the state and federal level, ordinances in the jurisdictional level. And those instruments are established through a governmental process that allows for public input. The public input process is critical to establishing good laws. And, again, public policy is created and implemented at various levels of government, including national, state, and local. I found this interesting too, is from a definitional standpoint. 3 types of public policies: regulatory, restrictive, and facilitating policies. So kind of working backwards, facilitating policies tend to be policies that are put in place to help interagency engagement or engagement between the agency and stakeholders. So I think for us in California Cannabis, one example is the creation of the now Department of Cannabis Control's Cannabis Advisory Committee. Joint powers authority between counties, county governments are another example of facilitating policy. Restrictive policy is really restricting an individual's activities or rights. And so age gating, for example, on tobacco, alcohol, and cannabis is an example of that. And then regulatory policies are, really broad bodies of governing regulation that agencies are implementing and are generally programmatic. So the Department of Cannabis Control and their correlative regulations, or the California Department of Food and Ag's Cannabis Appellations Program and their regulatory policies are another example. So with that, I am happy to pass it to you, Ross, to take it from here.
Well, wanted to dive into specifically some of the areas that we want to look at in this research. But first wanted to start with maybe just some big picture thoughts about dynamics in cannabis intellectual property that have sort of influenced how we think about this area of research. So I think first and foremost is recognizing that even if you're not talking about cannabis at all, intellectual property law, plant intellectual property law, overall is an extremely complicated topic. It's legally complicated. There's a lot of different forms of intellectual property protection. Each form of protection has its own nuances and applications. And it's also scientifically really complex in many cases when you're talking about plants, because you're talking about plant nomenclature, classification, genetics, things which are really, complicated empirical questions that in many cases require PhD level expertise to engage in. And so I think there's a couple things that, from our perspective, are important out front, acknowledging that complexity and thinking about that as we think about this research. One is it's probably really important to say out front, we are not providing legal advice to anyone. This presentation is not legal advice. The outputs of this research are not going to be legal advice. we understand that in any specific case, if you're someone who's interested in engaging with plant intellectual property, protecting your genetic resources in some way, it's very likely that situation is going to be very unique to you, and include a lot of specific considerations that you may want to have legal counsel for. Really, the goal here is to provide at first, some broad level education and kind of level setting about what sort of intellectual property tools and considerations are out there, to help inform some of those decisions, more so than providing specific advice in any case. I think another implication to this complexity is this is one thing that to us made it feel really important to have a sort of broad and multidisciplinary team of researchers around this. So Janine earlier referenced, some of the other researchers involved in this study, legal experts, scientific experts, experts in various fields of intellectual property, which are sometimes themselves can be very specialized. And so, neither Janine nor myself, nor I would expect anyone involved has all of the information or resources to, be able to speak at an expert level about everything in this topic. So it was really important for us to have that sort of multidisciplinary and broad approach to intellectual property. Considering this scientific complexity is also something that is really important to us as we think about what educational resources look like for the community. Again, we're not going to be able to, talk about every area. There's no educational output, which is going to examine every possible intellectual property issue. So I think a large part of this research, what is it that's really most important for the community to think about, know about in relation to intellectual property? What's really a basic understanding or some fundamental things which are important to understand? And then how do you sort of grow from there? And I think a last consideration is just acknowledging out front that intellectual property is not just complex, it's also evolving over time. In some cases, there might be statutory changes that govern intellectual property at the federal level. There may be different agency guidance coming from, for example, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. There may be standards of practice that are changing. And there also may be scientific developments, whether that's about specific plants or whether that's even biotechnological developments that change how plant intellectual property looks or how it's applied. And so keeping in mind that it's a field that inherently is changing and evolving over time as we're thinking about some of these issues. And by the way, just want to encourage, if anyone has questions or wants to stop me, feel free to add that in the chat or Q&A. And if it's natural to address it as we're kind of going through this, happy to address it there or address it in the Q&A at the end of the presentation here. So I think an additional consideration, plant IP law in general is complex, and also cannabis IP is unique and even more complex in various ways. And I think this is familiar for anybody who works in anything to do with cannabis, is oftentimes we have to deal with both the complexity and nuance of cannabis and cannabis law, and then as it relates to all of the other institutions, laws, policies that just govern every other aspect of our lives generally. So in cannabis, because we have federal cannabis prohibition, there are limits to available IP tools that would not be the case in other industries. So there are certain IP tools that apply to cannabis. There are other IP tools that don't, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. And that may include both the ability to get access to an IP tool, but also how is that IP tool implemented or enforced. Federal prohibition can affect all of those different kind of levels of what intellectual property looks like. Prohibition, both the legacy of it and the current reality of it, impacts a lot of the relevant institutional knowledge around cannabis. So Eleanor and Nick in their webinar a few weeks ago talked a lot about herbaria, and that most current commercially used agricultural crops have access to herbaria and have built out herbaria collections, and that has a lot of impact on how you look at intellectual property for those plants. Cannabis doesn't at this point. And so that's something which is going to change how intellectual property looks in the cannabis space. More broadly in scientific research as well, obviously there is scientific research on cannabis, but in many respects it's been stunted. Knowledge of the cannabis plant by prohibition. And so that can be relevant as well to a lot of intellectual property questions. The application of IP tools to cannabis is also largely new. There is the ability and has been the ability to apply certain intellectual property tools like patents to cannabis for many decades, even during, state and federal prohibition. That said, over the past decade, there's really been an explosion of people applying intellectual property to cannabis. And so you don't have the same level of, many decades or even centuries of intellectual property being applied to the cannabis plant as might be the case in most other industries. And finally, again, I think familiar for anyone who works in cannabis is whatever cannabis policy space we're talking about, it is impossible to avoid the consideration of quote unquote hemp. And many of you probably are familiar with the 2018 Farm Bill, which federally legalized hemp, which essentially is the cannabis plant with less than 0.3% THC. And the federal government moving in that way has created a lot of complications around the hemp and cannabis industries because hemp and cannabis are the same plant and are even grown in very, very similar ways if you're growing those plants for cannabinoid production. And so we've now got a set of intellectual property tools which are being applied to hemp, which in some ways means they're also being applied to cannabis. And yet there are these different legal frameworks applicable to both. So definitely want to consider the impact of hemp as well in this research. And finally, I think it's really important to acknowledge and understand that the communities stewarding the cannabis plant have our own unique characteristics. And so there's obviously the legacy and continued impact of prohibition, which is a legal impact, but also a cultural impact. Many people facing criminal sanctions because of their involvement with the plant. And many of those same people are now some of the greatest stewards of the plant's genetic diversity. That genetic diversity continues to be held largely by small home and medicinal producers. And so we're not talking about intellectual property protection in the context of a large biotech company that has a lot of resources to pursue that intellectual property protection. And we're also in a context where plants have often been stewarded communally rather than individually. And so we'll talk a bit about what that might look like and the existence of communal rather than individual intellectual property protection instruments as well. So just to give a brief overview of sort of the phases of this research, which we'll talk about here in turn. So part one of the scope is really educationally oriented as a survey of relevant IP and public policy instruments that apply to cannabis. Part two is trying to make some of that concrete, again, really with an educational goal in mind, in the form of case studies that show how those intellectual property instruments can play out or be used in real world contexts. And then in part three, taking that sort of basis of educational materials and kind of level setting, working with the community in various forms to think about what are the most important research directions that we want to pursue when it comes to cannabis and intellectual property. And then as Janine mentioned, based on the findings from parts 1 through 3, along with other research findings from the study, we want to put together a white paper that has some research-based policy recommendations for both preserving plant biodiversity in cannabis and protecting the communities that are stewarding that diversity. So to go through each of these parts, at least briefly in turn, just to give you a sense of kind of what we're looking at. So part one, as I mentioned, really an educational orientation, surveying the relevant IP instruments and public policy instruments that are out there that are relevant to cannabis. And so just to briefly talk about some of these, I think I want to call out patents a little bit as sort of a unique case and a special case, because this is really, I think, the most direct application of intellectual property to plants is patents and also plant varietable protections. And I think it's worth acknowledging that in many of the conversations I've had on this over many years, I think for a lot of people, there's sort of this immediate questioning of the idea of even applying intellectual property to life or to plants in the form of patents or whatever else. And this idea of can you own life? Can you own a plant? I think what to me feels really important is understanding that regardless of how you feel philosophically or legally about that question, the reality is we exist in a world and in a framework where in the United States and under international law, you can patent a plant. And in fact, there are many dozens of patents that already exist for cannabis or have been applied to cannabis. And so from my perspective, it's really important for all of us, and especially for legacy producing communities, to understand and be informed about what that means, what that looks like, how does that impact all of us collectively or individually. And so that's one reason we really want to start with education is because we exist within this world. So as far as patents go, I think it's worth saying that patents grant a right to exclude somebody from carrying out certain uses. And so patents are something that are available even under federal prohibition. And as I mentioned, there are many existing cannabis patents and many existing cannabis patent applications. And so this is something which is not limited by federal prohibition and currently is available. There's another form of plant intellectual property protection called plant varietal protections. These are administered under the U.S. Department of Agriculture rather than patents which are administered under the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And plant varietable protections are not currently available for cannabis under federal prohibition. And there are nuances that in this research we'll talk about how plant varietal protections are similar to or different from patent protections. But we're saying this is a different form of plant protection, which is not currently available for cannabis. There's a number of other intellectual property instruments which are relevant to cannabis that may not be on the plant themselves. So you have trademarks, which really speak to signs, designs, or representations that distinguish the source of a product. These are limited under federal prohibition. And so there's a sort of complex ecosystem about how trademarks can or cannot be applied to cannabis. Also various types of trademarks that we want to explore, collective marks, certification marks, geographic marks all have their own unique considerations. There's copyright, which gives the creators of a original work exclusive rights to that work. Things like logos, artwork, guides, websites, for example. Trade secrets, which don't require any formal protection. You don't register a trade secret, but that for confidential information can provide legal protection against misappropriation. And then licensing agreements as a pretty common protection mechanism for genetics in the industry currently, which may involve formal legal protection, but don't have to, and are sort of contractual arrangements to use plants or genetic resources in contractually specified ways. So I think that's a brief overview. And Janine, happy to hand it over to you to talk a little bit about public policy instruments as well.
Sure. Well, looking at the list here, I think labeling laws are fairly straightforward. So to move into speaking to geographical indications, this is an area of IP that really speaks to, first of all, it's a collective form of IP, generally speaking, and it speaks to products of place. And so by way of example, American viticultural areas for wine are an example of geographical indications, as are Idaho potatoes. So again, those are collectively applied towards qualifying producers. California is really leading the world globally in terms of geographical indication law for cannabis. So we have the California label, and that will come into play with interstate commerce as a geographical indication. We have in law county and city of origin. Those have been in law for some time now, I think since 2018. They're geographically defined. So in terms of political boundaries of a county, a city, or in some cases a county and city. So those are an opportunity for producers in those jurisdictions to work with local government to stand up potential county or city-based marketing programs for cannabis. And then we have CDFA's Cannabis Appellations Program, which has been in development really for over 10 years, if we're looking at the sort of legislation and statutory framework and the regulatory work that's been built upon that. And we anticipate the launch of the program to happen this year. And so that's really exciting, and it's setting a global precedent. And it's been noted, excuse me, in the international geographic indications community. And so that's a really exciting opportunity, I think, for the long game, particularly for craft producing community. So looking at the other terms, we've got statutorily protected terms, and so things like specialty crops. And this is kind of an interesting mechanism for opening pathways for specific legal entitlements in law and qualifications for public grant funding. Those are some of the things that we see kind of flowing out of protected terms. And then looking at agricultural commissions and marketing orders, these are created through legislation and generally applicable to agriculture. And they establish a public-private partnership between, in the case of California, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and, for example, the rice growers. So you'll have a body of producers of a particular commodity. They are generally applicable to commodity crops. And they're funded via an assessment on the producers. So that's essentially a mandated tax of sorts, which funds the work of the body on behalf of all of the producers in that sector. And so it's a really interesting sort of policy framework, how they're enacted. And looking at the two to differentiate, marketing orders are focused on marketing, whereas ag commissions can have a broader application, inclusive of research, marketing, and even advocacy. And then the last thing on the list here are publicly owned certification marks. And so this would be the National Organics Program, which is the mark itself, owned by the U.S. Department of Food and Agriculture. And the standards for what the mark embodies in terms of production and product quality standards are developed, with a public process, but really developed, codified by that agency. And then they work with third-party certifiers. So in California, we've got OCal certification under CDFA for cannabis, and that's, again, kind of the first of its kind in the United States, and it's really built to set farmers up to qualify eventually for the National Organics Program when we are out of prohibition federally. So those are some examples of public policy instruments, and happy to pass it back to you, Ross.
So for each of these public policy instruments, a number of questions that we want to answer as part of this phase of research. The purpose of the instrument, understanding who qualifies to use it and how it can be accessed or applied for. Understanding how the prohibition of cannabis and its status on the Controlled Substances Act impacts the accessibility of those instruments. Doing some analysis on how that instrument applies or doesn't apply to hemp. And then thinking about how either rescheduling or descheduling of cannabis might change access to those instruments. And we're saying, of course, there's this conversation around potentially moving cannabis to Schedule 3, initiated under the Biden administration, currently postponed under the Trump administration. I think unclear at this point, at least to me, whether that's something which is going to move forward or not. But at this point, considering that, there's still a world in which cannabis maybe moves to Schedule 3, maybe stays in Schedule 1, maybe is moved off the CSA entirely, doing some analysis of how those different worlds might impact access to these intellectual property instruments. So that's sort of phase one. Phase two is sort of continuing the sort of educational orientation of this, and moving some of that more abstract discussion of intellectual property mechanisms into concrete examples. So we're interested in putting together a number of different case study examples that explore how those intellectual property protections can be utilized in practice. It may, look at how different intellectual property protection mechanisms work together or synergize together in a way that, can be relevant, might look at the process for applying for things, practical barriers that people might encounter, and sort of just make concrete the more abstract analysis from part one. Janine, did you want to add a few thoughts here as well?
Yeah, I think I really just want to emphasize that, again, the education piece is core to the community-based participatory research approach that we're taking, and working to educate ourselves and the community about IP, and then to carry through and really ground that understanding through case studies in terms of pragmatic real-world examples is really a part of the intention here, to really strengthen and empower the community, then to set ourselves up collectively to garner your input and participation for the phase beyond this, where we take it a bit deeper in terms of further looking at research questions that are really a priority of the community.
So I think that leads sort of naturally into part three, which is sort of using the educational materials from parts 1 and 2 to inform sort of a community conversation about what intellectual property and public policy topics are really a priority for the community. So this takes place in a number of forums, conversations with the community advisory board, among project personnel at the community meetings, and I'll include this webinar as well, sort of in that place where input can happen. So as I mentioned earlier, I mean, there's so many different places that an intellectual property conversation can go. It's such a broad area. There's state level considerations, federal considerations, international considerations, a lot of practical issues and barriers that people face. And so really trying to prioritize those issues which are going to be most practically useful to the community is something that we really want to prioritize. And so I want to provide just a couple of initial ideas and examples of what this might look like, based on a lot of the initial conversations that I've been a part of, we've all been a part of, in the first months of this project, as well as just being part of this community and these conversations for the past decade or so. And really just providing these as examples of the types of topics that we could do a deeper dive into. So one thing that has come up a lot for as long as I've been involved in this space is the question of defensive intellectual property. So sort of setting aside the question of, do you, as a breeder or a farmer, are you interested in protecting your intellectual property? Are you interested in protecting your genetics in some way? You don't necessarily have to be interested in that to be interested in intellectual property, because I think there's also this concern that somebody could try to claim an intellectual property right over something that either you own or the community owns, or really, is out there in the public domain. And so understanding what is the current landscape, in particular around cannabis patent applications, I think is a big part of this. So you can see some screenshots here on the slide, some examples of this. There is currently, some of you may be familiar with, a patent application for any cannabis that contains between 5 and 25% of the cannabinoid THCV. And I think there's definitely dispute over whether that's something which any individual can claim a patent right to, right? And so are there ways to, think about, provide evidence of what sort of cannabis plants or genetics are already held in the community that could be relevant to whether this patent application is granted? There are also, you can see in the bottom right here, many specific cannabis plants which have already been patented. And so understanding what that landscape is, how does that impact or influence the genetic resources the communities currently hold? And then thinking strategically about how can legacy producers, individually or communally, think about defensive intellectual property to prevent some ownership from being claimed that in fact does not belong to that person. Want to acknowledge this is something that Nick and Eleanor talked about as well in their presentation and the role of herbaria in this topic. And I think it's something where there's a lot of different directions and considerations, places you could go. Another topic I'll offer just as an example, something that comes up a lot, is thinking about what is federal legalization going to look like for cannabis intellectual property? And are there reasons why cannabis intellectual property deserves some specific or unique consideration if and when cannabis is federally legalized? So there are things about cannabis that are fairly unique compared to other federally legal commodities, crops, products. For example, we currently have all of these state legal markets, but no legal interstate commerce. Certain intellectual property protection, for example, around trademarks, really deals with is a product in interstate commerce. So what does it mean that we have, at this point, over a decade of commerce in cannabis, which is supposedly just taking place within states? Also thinking about what is the impact of having these state legal markets, which exist, which in many cases are growing, at the same time as very normal forms of intellectual property, for example, trademarks, are being denied in those areas. Is that something which federal law needs to take into account? I think there are a lot of specific things you could think about. And it's worth saying that although, we don't have federally legal cannabis, and we don't know if this is something which is how heavily it's going to be pursued under the Trump administration, we have reached the point where federal legislators are really seriously considering not just cannabis legalization, but the real fine details of cannabis legalization. So the screenshot here is from the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, which is legislation co-sponsored by Chuck Schumer in the US Senate for several years now. It's not just a bill to legalize cannabis, it's many hundreds of pages long, and it is an entire, very precise, specified regulatory system for all aspects of cannabis. Right now, these sorts of policy proposals don't include consideration specifically of intellectual property. So is that something which should be considered in these types of proposals? And if so, what should that look like? So that's the type of question that potentially we could explore. So maybe with that, feel like it's a good time to pause, see if anybody has any questions or thoughts they want to share, either sort of on this topic of potential research directions under part 3 and 4 and going forward, or just generally about anything related to the project or intellectual property. Happy to take some time now and open it up for questions or comments. So feel free to raise your hands, use the chat or Q&A, however you prefer. AC Moon is your hand.
Good day, and thank you so much for all your guys' hard work. As always, you are absolutely leading some extremely essential topics that I have been working on for a very long time myself, and I have a lot of respect. I was looking I work a lot in the international space, and as we look at plant breeding rights as also an aspect of the IP portfolio options, and learning and investigating how to do your 3-year documentation trials for the research and development of your intellectual property, I think would probably be a great addition to your curricula. Just in the point of, we know that patents do not have value unless they are wanted. So essentially a lot of patents are, in my opinion, worth less because the education aspect isn't there of how to market or stance yourself into a licensing point. So I would think that those might be points of fail that I have seen that might need a little bit of extra attention. And then I also wanted to ask if through any of these, are you working with Canopy Right, or are you keeping LeafWorks into an herbaria format? Have you chosen a format that would also dictate the internet's, such as Canopy Right had put through towards the blockchain IP identification system? Or are your platforms strictly about the herbarium, which is the physical book, which is absolutely amazing, and I love it so much. But I was just curious on if you were indenting into the internet world or keeping it in a tactile form.
So really appreciate that question. I'll just say to sort of the first half of it, I think that's a great thing to note, and I think that's an important thing to look into as part of our research. So happy to add that to the list. And Janine, maybe do you want to take on the second half of that question?
Well, actually, we've got Eleanor with us, and so if it's okay, Eleanor, do you mind if I pass that question, second part of the question to you? Sorry to put you on the spot. Maybe she popped off. Well, in terms of LeafWorks Holdings with the herbarium, really the model is sort of built on replicates in a sense. So making sure that folks that submit have a voucher specimen, which is the physical plant pressing, and the accessional data that goes with it. So information about the plant, the growing context in some cases, all the things that help to identify the qualities and nature of the plant is the accessional data. And so LeafWorks has the herbarium holdings generally, and then each of the folks that submit have their own replicate as well. And generally, the way that herbariums are structured, they partner with other herbariums as well. It's like a library of sorts, right? And so it's good to have replicates in various places because things happen to, you know, physical voucher specimens, unfortunately, due to fire, et cetera, et cetera. So I understand that to be the framework for the herbarium model. And as Ross said, you know, I think we're really interested in looking at some of these other systems and models and organizations that are working in this space. But that is my fundamental understanding of how LeafWorks and Candor, their nonprofit arm that governs the herbarium, works.
I see a couple questions from Bill in the Q&A. I don't know, maybe Janine, if you want to answer the first one, I can answer the second one. Or I could answer the second one first. You need a second to pull it up.
Yeah, why don't you go for it and I'll take a look here.
Cool. So Bill, I see your question. What should the industry of California cannabis look like at the conclusion of the program? Obviously a big question. I think it's beyond the scope of this research, which is really focused on education, you know, providing policy recommendations for protecting cannabis biodiversity and legacy producing communities. All of that said, I think that that question of policy recommendations, you know, to support cannabis biodiversity and legacy producing communities, I think Janine spoke to it earlier. A lot of it, you know, has to do with intellectual property or with things that are very specific to plant genetic resources. But I also don't think we can ignore that in California, we have an entire legal and regulatory framework governing cannabis, every aspect of cannabis. And that framework as a whole has a major impact on cannabis biodiversity. Even if, you know, a specific policy doesn't seem to directly be about that, it's still impacting the nature of biodiversity within the system. Things like market access, for example, can farmers get their products to market? Things like, are you allowed to be a legal cultivator in any given region of California because of local control? So I don't think this research, you know, obviously is not going to single-handedly change any policy. But one thing we do want to do is produce policy recommendations and research outputs, which can help to inform a broader conversation to help policymakers understand the interconnectedness of some of these issues. And that, you know, if you're interested in preserving plant biodiversity, which I think most people are, there's a lot about the current framework that could be relevant to that, that you might want to take a look at.
Yeah, and then looking at the first question you put forward, Bill, regarding the funding. So Proposition 64 mandates that the cannabis tax funds contribute towards in-state cannabis academic research. I believe it's $10 million from the cannabis tax funds that's allocated per year. DCC recently started allocating every other year. And so there's a number of research projects that have been funded and some have been completed. If you go to the Department of Cannabis Control's website, you can see all of the projects that are currently ongoing and those previous projects that have completed. What we've not been able to access, and it's a sort of ongoing conversation, is the deliverables and final reports from the projects. And so that's one of the reasons that we wanted to be very proactive about standing up the project website and really pushing those materials out in real time to the community and to the public at large. So there's a lot of really interesting research topics that are being explored. And so really want to encourage folks to check that out and engage with the academic community. I think this project's really unique because it is community-based participatory research. And it is a partnership between the legacy producing community and our community-based organizations that are involved in this project directly with the academic community. And it's something that we are working on within this project in terms of creating a model for community-based participatory research that can be replicated or built upon by other community-based organizations to really advance that partnership approach to academic research that's community engaged.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments from folks? Sam?
Yeah, I'd love to allow others to go first. So I was kind of holding back there. But yeah, definitely. And feel free to, everyone reach out and email if you have questions as well, info@legacygenetics.org. If you have any focus questions for any of the co-PIs or anything like that. But I was just curious, like, in addressing concerns that people have had. I mean, I come from 20 years of legacy cultivation in Mendocino County. And concerns that people have regarding their coveted stashes and these seed saving adventures that they've been on for decades, some of them, concerns around monopolization and competition. You know what I mean? If they are interested in introducing these cultivars and genetics, on a patented front, or even if they just want to get them out to community and are concerned about others exploiting them or monopolizing them or something. So, just really want to address those kind of concerns that are inherent with our cannabis culture, right? Because we've been so counterculture for so long.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Sam. And those are concerns that, I hear all the time in my own role. And so I think that's one reason to me the educational basis of this feels really important because I think that education has not been available in a sort of centralized way that really is applicable to cannabis and that is really informed by the questions that people are asking and need answers to. So whether your interest is in, commercializing your genetic resources, whether you're interested is in not commercializing your genetic resource because you want everyone to have access to it, your interest is in preventing somebody else from monopolizing it. All of that, from my perspective, relies on basic understanding and education on what options are out there, what's a real threat, what's not a real threat, what are your options, how affordable are those options, right? Like, so, and that's not going to be a simple answer. And as I said earlier, like everyone's case is going to be different, but hopefully providing some resources for folks to be able to think about that, it is, I think, a major role here. Wade, I see your hand. And then Gene, happy to go to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. I was particularly interested in the conversation this morning out of one, being a patient myself, but also knowing many people who, for one reason or another, count on very specific versions of the cannabis plant for relief from seizures, for example. And we're talking about, if there's 100 kids who have seizures, one or two of those kids respond favorably to this specific version of the cannabis plant. And I'm very concerned at what I see happening in the greater cannabis marketplace. And I would love to hear that I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me we have a very pointed focus on developing versions of the cannabis plant that produce prodigious amounts of THC to the exclusion of all of the other cannabinoids that we've come to realize are really important. And again, as a patient, I got to say, we wouldn't have any version of legal cannabis today if it were not for the medicinal aspects of this plant. And so my question, or my request, I guess it's not really even a question, it's a request. What are we as a community going to do to preserve these very special versions of the cannabis plant that only help a few people? But we're talking saving lives here. And I recognize that the market drives our farmers towards what's going to make them money. What will they be able to sell? And that's a difficult thing. But the fact is, I feel like as a community, we have a responsibility to those who count on the cannabis plant literally for their lives. We have to figure out a way to preserve these specific versions of the cannabis plant that literally can save lives. They won't ever make anybody any money, or maybe someday we get the thing all twisted around and insurance companies start paying for cannabis medicine. That'd be spectacular, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. So again, I don't have an answer to my question, but I suppose I'm throwing it out as a challenge. What are we as a community going to do to preserve these very specific, very special versions of our cannabis plant that we love so much? And I'll shush and listen now. Thank you.
Thank you, Wade. I'd love to respond to that and just first and foremost say thank you for everything that is you, and for entering the space and having an incredible way of being the true north, I think, for our work as we continue to try and support our community and really align our values in the work that we're doing. And I want to say that there is an unfortunate existential pressure on our farmers that, has one of the outcomes that you're speaking to, which is, we're losing genetic diversity, not just because of farmers on pressure, but, lack of access to the regulated space, enforcement pressures. It's an annual plant. And so, one of the things that I think we're examining, and I think Dominic's work in this project is examining, the impact of not just prohibition, but legalization and regulation and taxation on biodiversity. And, the medicinal utility of this plant is what has driven drug policy reform. And so I think that there are certainly research questions on the table within this project to try and address and really shine a light on what you're saying. And I really appreciate you bringing that forward to me.
Gene, as your hand.
Hi, yeah, and maybe I can offer an answer for Wade too. I do research in cannabis chemotype, so that's the chemical composition of the plant. And I really believe adding chemotype to the herbarium identification of the plant would be useful in at least preserving this. As a physician following cannabis using patients for medical reasons, Back in the day, thankfully, there was a grower named Ringo who was growing Ringo's Gift that we were able to extract the oil and give to a young girl who was having seizures and stop her seizures. And yeah, that plant, I study the chemical types of plants in the community, was disappearing. It's come back a bit, but it was disappearing. Also, looking at subtypes, types like Blue Dream, which had a high alpha pinene level, that seemed to be disappearing for a while, but it is coming back too. So I think it might be just useful to include the plant's chemotype into our information. And also, the GW Pharmaceuticals took Ringo's plant and isolated CBD and created a pharmaceutical from it. And Ringo never got any credit for preserving that type. And that would have been great for him or the community to get credit for keeping that going.
Thanks, Jean. And we do have some funding reserved in the project for chemical analysis to for the specimens that are being submitted. So absolutely. I think that's part of what I love about cannabis, and part of the challenge is it really requires a multidisciplinary approach and cooperation and complexity. So thank you for bringing that forward, and thank you for your work.
Love to help if I can.
Thanks, Jim. And I just want to add on this topic. I know I talk to so many farmers who really do not want to be growing just the highest THC weed, like really, really don't want to be doing that, and would really prefer to be, or have attempted to grow, different specialty cultivars, or plants that have medicinal properties, or plants that have a unique chemical profile. And from what I have seen, it's as you mentioned, Wade, just very difficult in the current market. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that's true. I'll put out there just as one reason: the lack of direct-to-consumer sales. Those farmers don't necessarily have the ability to get their plants, their product to market in a way that doesn't rely on intermediaries. And so I think that's one barrier and challenge. And I think there's a lot of barriers and challenges throughout the realm of public policy, intellectual property, that all feed into that. So from my perspective, that's one thing that I think is an important part of this research scope. And also just acknowledging that formally part of this research scope is thinking about not just small commercial producers, but also medicinal producers and home producers. So I think that's all very explicitly part of what we hope to work on here. Adrian, I see your hand.
Hey, thanks, Ross, and thanks, Janine, for hosting today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be able to share this space with Wade and Dr. Talleyrand, who I just got to meet down at the Berkeley event about legacy cannabis genetics. So this is really awesome, and also how well that previous conversation was going to sync up with where I was going, and how do we work with this kind of space, so to speak, in between intellectual property and naming conventions. And as Dr. Talleyrand brought up, the chemovar work that is so important in cannabis, when at the same time trying to explore how different cultivation methodologies and locations produce different varieties of compounds in the same plant. And that's something that I'm really interested in as somebody who wants to pursue an appellation of origin in the future. And I want to be able to produce, a product at the end of the day that can be named and can be known, yet like honor and like really revel in the fact that somebody in a different valley doing the same thing gets some different results. And I think that has a lot of play in the medical world too, where, as Wade was saying, there are these certain compounds, certain plants that work differently for certain people. And it could be as much as beyond just the genotype of the plant, but also the cultivation and the location and the methodologies involved. So that's it. Thank you. And thank you so much for doing this today.
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that a little bit. I think it's going to be a really interesting endeavor as everything normalizes and matures. But the boundaries, right, of definition, and you know, we struggle with overly broad utility patents on cannabis now, that are, you know, defined as this amazingly broad collection of constituents. And, you know, I think it's really interesting and critical that these definitions and boundaries are really driven by farmers, with respect to cultivars, because, you know, as you're innovating, really, like, what is the boundary between something that may be defined as a blue dream, and then it starts to innovate and become, through its chemical profile or other aspects of the plant, something new, right? So I think it's an exciting area of discovery, and kind of one of the amazing and challenging things about cannabis. It just feels so infinite because it's so complex as a plant. And then, you know, you bring our endocannabinoid system into it and it's infinitely complex. But it's something I really look forward to exploring.
Right. AC Moon, that's your hand.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I also have been studying these things worldwide, doing acclimation and mutation studies for about 22 years. But I have been working with the ASTM, you might know Darwin, and the series and point that I made to him and am now making in a topical discussion that's going international is really focusing on the top of the problem is exactly what you said, Ross, is, in my opinion, is the actual binomial nomenclature and having no chemovaric separation at the point of utilization, which is in Latin binomial nomenclature, which is us as horticulturists and botanists. We're supposed to be identifying the structure, characteristics, or habits of a plant through those Latin terminologies that are embedded into that. And on a worldwide structure, it's really altered laws, in my opinion, and regulations have become very construed, such as our Hemp Act opposed to medical marijuana or high THC, because that binomial nomenclature hasn't been separated. So I've been looking towards, and I'm now speaking at the ASTM conference in that exact respect of trying to push towards the world recognizing that we need to separate the indica, sativa, and ruderalis, in my opinion. And so if anybody in this beautiful group that Janine and these wonderful people have interest in lobbying towards those upper aspectual points of how of really lobbying for chemovaric testing to be in the topmost point so that we can define the indica, sativa, ruderalis, and then it kind of like spreads laws and advocacy, and how everything will change once we have that separation, in my opinion. So if anybody wants to connect, I appreciate you guys. And I think these subjects are extremely important for us to popularize. Thank you.
Thanks, AC. Really appreciate the work you're doing. And I know we're overdue to jump on a call. So I think Sam and I are going to reach out and schedule with you. I'm really appreciative of all of your support and the work you're doing. So thank you so much. And I'd love to also address your question, Bill. So you asked, will there be marketing opportunities by participating? Any ideas what state efforts will result from policies? No direct marketing opportunities by participating. I mean, we are trying our very best to be robust with our outreach and, you know, engage the community. And I think that there's a growing interest in this project and that will continue over time. And in terms of state efforts, you know, it's hard to read the tea leaves with what the state will do. And I think that will play out over time. But, you know, one of the things I'm really interested in exploring is, you know, we obviously have many constraints and disadvantages because of federal prohibition and cannabis not being recognized as agriculture. And so, you know, I'm curious to see what the sort of outputs of this research are with respect to the positioning of cannabis farmers in the broader context, particularly standing next to hemp and its differentiated status.
Hello.
Well, if there's no more other questions at this moment, we do have a couple of more slides and some more things we wanted to share with you before we wrap today. So if you're good with that, Ross, we can kind of move on to those.
I had a quick comment.
Oh, go for it.
With AC Moon, there is a definition of method of sale in current federal handbooks 44, which are weights and measures. And they do define it, and it's currently defined as cannabis indica or cannabis sativa, indica, or ruderalis, or any hybrids thereof. That's the current definition that exists in the method of sale. And then the ASTM standard is at 3% moisture activity. I attend those meetings. I'm retired now, but I attend those meetings to shepherd this issue. And we just met in Charleston, South Carolina for the interim meeting. The annual meeting will be in Reno this summer, but it's already in the handbooks in case people didn't know. And there is a method of sale. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. AC, did you want to add a quick comment?
Yeah, I don't want to capitalize your time. Just to respond, sir, I would really love to talk to you. I love working with everybody that is working on any level of this advocacy change, but I'm actually looking towards binomial nomenclatures as a separation themselves. What it's standardized and what you just explained right there is it's actually varietals of sativa. And so technically, if we were to really like engage the federal laws, all cannabis is legal because all cannabis is sativa. And so, and sativa just means to be cultivated. And so in Latin terms, it doesn't describe botanically what that is, which it should describe tall, upward, linear leaf plant, but it doesn't. It just cannabis cultivated. And so really what my focus is separating the actual botanical nomenclature so that to assist policies, laws, and other things in separating it. And they've started this in the UK by naming ruderalis, cannabis spontanea. And so the specific epithet at the end is SP, meaning specific. And so the spontanea is a Latin term for spontaneous growth. So that, to me, as a botanist, is somebody that I can read that and say that part of cannabis, it goes into bloom at a spontaneous time. So that's autoflower to us. So for me, it's separating binomial nomenclatures, and science just helps all the other aspects of it. In commerce and things like that, I do agree with you. There are those schedulings, but it's all because of their varietals and not separated. And I seek to separate them so that we can define things better through chemovar testing. Thank you.
I would dearly love to talk to you. My phone number is 530-623-1356. And anyone else who wants to call me.
Thanks, guys.
Did you get it?
Well, AC, maybe connect with Joseph if you didn't catch that. I think on that topic, I've mentioned this a bit before, but just want to conclude and say, all of this research, along with the research we're doing in the other parts of the study, which you can find the other webinars recorded and posted on legacygenetics.org, are going to ultimately inform a set of research-based policy recommendations. And again, I want to flag that those will definitely relate to intellectual property, but also consider more broadly what are the public policy barriers that are impeding cannabis biodiversity and impeding the success of legacy producing communities. So really, at the end of this, want to be really broad and comprehensive about what those policy recommendations might be, so we can facilitate that conversation going forward. Janine, did you have anything to add to that?
No, thanks, Ross.
Good.
Well, I wanted to sort of wrap up with speaking to timelines for the project, next steps, and how folks can get involved. So we're currently hosting focus group meetings. We've been referred to members of the community by our community-based organizations that are partnered with us on the project. And the focus groups are intended to help us build criteria so that we can have a solid recruitment plan in place to establish our community advisory board, which will be 13 members of the legacy producing community, and representation's critical for us. And so we want to ensure that we've got representation from rural, urban, and BIPOC communities, and a real focus on exceptional knowledge, experience, and expertise relevant to legacy genetics. We are seeking the experts that will guide us as researchers on all aspects of the project. You can learn more about the work of the CAB and the focus groups if you watch the webinar regarding our CVPR methodology and our community outreach education and engagement plan, and that's up on our website. We're really excited to be planning with our community-based organizations that we're partnered with to be hosting local 2-day community meetings with the whole entire research team in all of our study areas. And so we'll be focused on presenting in our respective research areas, providing educational programming, facilitating hands-on demonstrations, the herbarium science, and facilitating those community discussions and input into the research at those meetings. So please do sign up for our email list, and feel free to shoot questions to us as well, info@legacygenetics.org. And we'll be, promoting and putting up information on our website as we lock in those dates to promote those community meetings coming up. And again, just really want to encourage folks to check out our website. We're really building and growing the content on there as the project unfolds. And so you'll find information about the entire team working on the project, and project updates, upcoming events, recordings of all of our webinars, educational materials. And then when we get to the point of research data analysis, project deliverables, and soon we'll be opening up for nomination forms for research participants. And once we've gone through our focus group and established our criteria, nominations for folks that want to participate on the community advisory board. So keep a lookout for all of that on our website, and please send us an email if you want to chat or connect with anybody in the research team and get on our emailing list. Really, really appreciate everyone today. It was an amazing conversation, and I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in person at the community meetings that are coming up this year. Thank you so much, Ross. It's such a pleasure to work with you, and yeah, really appreciate the work that everyone here is doing. Thanks all. Have a great weekend.